Spring awakened the hills above the Bosphorus as Emperor Constantine stood where Asia and Europe nearly touched, surveying a landscape that would soon become the stage for one of history's greatest transformations. Before him sprawled the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, its modest fortifications and weathered temples bearing the patina of 700 years. Constantine saw beyond this present reality to a grander vision, a Rome reborn that would outlast the marble monuments of the eternal city itself. Born of both pragmatism and prophecy, the sovereign's decision to establish his seat here reflected the empire's changing center of gravity. Rome had grown unwieldy, its senators too steeped in pagan tradition, its people too attached to the old gods. Real wealth now lay eastward in Egyptian grain, Chinese silk, and Indian spices. At this narrow strait where the Black Sea met the Mediterranean, where caravans from Persia encountered ships from Greece, Constantine would build not merely another urban center, but the beating heart of a Christian empire. Ceremonies, both ancient and revolutionary, accompanied the beginning of construction. Walking the boundaries of his future seat on the 11th of May, 330, Constantine traced out fortifications that would encompass 7 hills in conscious imitation of Rome. Where Roman priests might have sacrificed to Jupiter and Mars, Christian bishops blessed the foundations with holy water and sacred relics. Above construction sites where thousands labored to realize their sovereign's dream flew the labarum, the Chi Rho standard that had appeared to Constantine in his vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Breathtaking speed characterized the rise of this imperial creation. Constantine stripped treasures from throughout the ancient sphere to adorn his project. From Delphi came the Serpent Column, bronze testimony to Greek victory over the Persians, finding a place in the Hippodrome. Statues of gods and heroes from throughout the empire were transported to grace the forums and squares. Egyptian obelisks joined Roman columns in creating a skyline that proclaimed this place heir to all civilizations that had come before. No expense was spared in creating institutions worthy of this vision. Sprawling across terraces overlooking the Sea of Marmara, the great palace complex displayed halls adorned with mosaics depicting both classical mythology and Christian symbolism. Larger even than Rome's Circus Maximus, the Hippodrome could accommodate 100,000 spectators who came to cheer the chariot races that remained the empire's most popular entertainment. Rising to accommodate senators loyal to Constantine's vision rather than ancient traditions, the Senate House symbolized the break with the past. Neither palace nor circus formed the crown jewel of Constantine's creation, but rather the forum that bore his name. At its center stood a porphyry column, 120 feet high, topped by a statue of the sovereign himself, radiating sunbeams like Apollo, but bearing the cross of Christ. Within this column, Constantine placed the most sacred relics he could gather: pieces of the true cross, nails from the crucifixion, even the axe with which Noah had built his ark. Clear was the message. This was not merely a political seat, but a holy city, the earthly reflection of the heavenly Jerusalem. From throughout the known sphere came the population that filled Constantine's creation. Greek merchants brought their trade networks and cultural sophistication. Roman administrators carried legal traditions and bureaucratic expertise that had governed vast territories for ages. Christian refugees, fleeing persecution in distant provinces, found sanctuary in a place where their faith was not merely tolerated, but officially favored. Jews, Armenians, Syrians, and Egyptians added their own traditions to the cosmopolitan mix, creating a cultural synthesis unlike anything previously seen. Maturation from imperial ambition into urban reality characterized the progress through the 400 years. strategic position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia made it the natural hub for trade between East and West. Silk from China passed through its markets on the way to Rome. Spices from India were weighed and sold in its warehouses. Grain from Egypt fed its growing population. Tolls and taxes generated by this commerce filled the royal treasury and funded ever grander building projects. Under Theodosius I, in the late 400 years, the imperial seat became firmly established as the senior center of the Roman sphere. When the sovereign divided the empire between his sons in 395, this city became the heart of the eastern domains, equal in dignity to Rome itself, but increasingly superior in wealth and power. While the old center might claim the prestige of antiquity, the younger rival controlled trade routes that linked Europe to Asia. During the 500 years, this urban center acquired defenses that would define its character for the following millennium. As barbarian tribes pressed on the Danube frontier and Hunnic horsemen threatened the Balkans, Theodosius II recognized that his seat needed protection worthy of its importance. Between the early and mid-500s, under supervision of Praetorian prefect Anthemius, the greatest fortification system in the ancient sphere rose across the landward approach to the city. Stretching for nearly 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn, the Theodosian fortifications consisted of 3 separate defensive lines. Outermost was a moat 60 feet wide and 22 feet deep, which could be flooded in times of danger. Behind the moat stood the outer barrier, 27 feet high and studded with 96 towers. Final defense came from the inner rampart, rising 40 feet above the city and protected by its own line of towers, each one a fortress capable of independent defense. Accumulated engineering wisdom of ages was represented in these defenses. Alternating courses of brick and stone provided both strength and flexibility, allowing them to absorb earthquake shocks that periodically shook the region. Positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, the towers ensured that no attacker could approach the barriers without coming under bombardment from multiple directions. Additional fortifications protected gates, creating deadly killing zones for any enemy who attempted to force an entrance. Almost immediately upon their completion, the fortifications faced their first test. An earthquake damaged significant portions of the defensive system, but the citizenry worked day and night to repair the damage before Attila the Hun could exploit the weakness. When the Hunnic army arrived before this stronghold, they found defenses stronger than ever and a population determined to defend them. Attila, the scourge of Europe who had brought Rome to its knees, looked upon those massive ramparts and decided to seek easier prey elsewhere. Within protection of these barriers, the Queen of Cities flourished as never before. Populations swelled to perhaps 500,000 souls, making it one of the largest urban centers anywhere. Magnificent churches rose to serve the spiritual needs of this Christian stronghold. Built by Constantine himself, the Church of the Holy Apostles became the burial place of rulers and the symbolic heart of imperial Christianity. Dominating the harbour district, the Church of Saints Peter and Paul joined dozens of smaller churches, serving individual neighbourhoods and ethnic communities. Beginning in the 600 years, the reign of Justinian the Firm represented the zenith of early achievement in this reborn Rome. Remembered as the Great, this sovereign inherited territories stretching from the Danube to the cataracts of the Nile, but his ambitions reached back to the Mediterranean unity that the ancient empire had once provided. Under his general Belisarius, imperial armies reconquered North Africa from the Vandals and much of Italy from the Ostrogoths. For a brief moment, it seemed the Roman dominion might be restored in its ancient glory. Architectural rather than military achievement represented Justinian's greatest legacy. The Nika riots had destroyed much of the city's center, including the original church of Hagia Sophia, built by Constantine. From this destruction, Justinian envisioned something unprecedented, a church that would surpass all buildings of antiquity, a structure worthy of the heavenly Jerusalem itself. Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus designed a building that seemed to defy the laws of physics. 180 feet above the floor and more than 100 feet in diameter, Hagia Sophia's dome appeared to float without visible support. Procopius, the court historian, wrote that the dome seemed not to rest upon solid masonry, but to cover the space as though it were suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Height of artistic achievement was represented in Hagia Sophia's interior. 40 windows around the base of the dome filled the vast space with light that seemed almost supernatural. Quarried from the most distant provinces of the empire, marble columns supported galleries where the court could worship in splendor. Gradually covering every surface, mosaics depicted Christ, the Virgin Mary, rulers, and saints in glittering gold and brilliant colors that transformed the building into an earthly vision of paradise. Upon Hagia Sophia's consecration, Justinian is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." No idle boast was this. No building in the Christian sphere could match its grandeur, its engineering audacity, or its spiritual impact. For nearly 1,000 years, it would remain the largest enclosed space on earth, a monument to God's glory and the power of the state that served him. Legal codification in the Corpus Juris Civilis also distinguished Justinian's reign, creating a framework that would influence jurisprudence for ages to come. Establishing the university as a rival to Athens and Alexandria, the sovereign attracted scholars from throughout the known sphere. Trade flourished under his rule, with the imperial seat becoming the undisputed commercial hub of the Mediterranean. Even at its height, however, the empire faced challenges that would shape its future character. Sweeping through the Mediterranean region in the mid-600 years, plague devastated the population and weakened the state's ability to hold its reconquered territories. Slavs and Bulgars pressed on the Danube frontier, while Persian armies threatened the provinces. Most significantly, Islam's rise in the 700 years would present this Christian stronghold with an entirely different kind of challenge. Transformation of the surrounding sphere came with Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries. Damascus, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, urban centers that had been pillars of Christian civilization, fell to Muslim armies that combined religious fervor with military innovation. Reduced to a core of Greek-speaking lands around the imperial seat, Anatolia, and scattered holdings in Italy and the Balkans, the empire lost its richest provinces. Still, the mighty city endured. Massive ramparts that had turned back Attila proved equally effective in repelling Arab armies. In the late 700 years, and again in the early 8th, Muslim fleets besieged the stronghold, but could not overcome its defenses. Greek fire, the secret weapon of the imperial navy, destroyed Arab ships in the harbors of the Golden Horn. Smaller, but also more cohesive, the state that emerged from these trials was bound together by Orthodox Christianity and Greek culture in ways that Justinian's diverse empire had never been. Both strengths and weaknesses of this civilization were revealed in the iconoclastic controversies of the 8th and 9th hundreds. When Leo III banned veneration of religious images, he sparked a conflict that would rage for more than 100 years. Led by monks and popular religious leaders, supporters of icons clashed with iconoclastic rulers who saw image veneration as idolatry. The imperial seat became the battlefield for this theological struggle, with churches stripped of their mosaics and frescoes, monasteries dissolved, and religious communities torn apart by doctrinal disputes. The resolution of the iconoclastic controversy represented a triumph for Orthodox tradition, while also revealing the growing divide between Greek and Latin Christianity, supporting the icon venerators in opposition to the imperial rulers. The Pope in Rome created tensions that would eventually lead to complete separation of the Orthodox and Catholic churches. The imperial stronghold increasingly saw itself as the defender of true Christianity in the face of both Muslim conquest and Catholic deviation. Under the Macedonian dynasty, beginning in the 900 years, revival of imperial power brought renewed glory to the Queen of Cities. Rulers like Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, extended control deep into the Balkans and Anatolia. Recovery from previous devastations brought the population once again close to 500,000 inhabitants. Rising to replace those damaged during the iconoclastic period, churches displayed interiors covered with mosaics that proclaimed Orthodox faith's triumph. Transformation into the scholarly center of the medieval sphere characterized this period's intellectual renaissance. Students from throughout Europe and the Muslim regions were attracted to the university. Imperial scholars preserved and copied classical texts that might otherwise have been lost, maintaining learning traditions that stretched back to Athens and Alexandria. Works of philosophy, science, history, and literature that existed nowhere else filled the libraries. Gradual reopening under imperial protection came to trade routes that had been disrupted by Arab conquests. Italian merchants, first from Amalfi, later from Venice and Genoa, established trading posts in the imperial seat, bringing European goods in exchange for luxury products of the East. Once again, the markets bustled with merchants speaking a dozen languages, selling everything from English wool to Chinese silk. Seeds of future problems were contained in this very success. Italian merchants who brought prosperity also introduced competition for local traders. Privileges granted to Venice gave foreigners advantages over domestic ones, beginning a process that would gradually undermine the empire's economic independence. More immediately threatening was growing power of Turkish tribes in Anatolia, who began pressing on the frontiers just as the state seemed to be recovering its strength. Beginning of the end for imperial Anatolia came with disaster at Manzikert, where Romanos IV was captured by the Seljuk Turks. Within a generation, Turkish tribes had overrun most of the peninsula that had been the heartland of power for hundreds of years. Reduced to control over a portion of Anatolia, the immediate vicinity of the imperial seat, and scattered territories in the Balkans and southern Italy, the Queen of Cities found itself increasingly isolated, beginning with Alexios III. In the late 1100 years, rulers of the Komnenos dynasty proved that the imperial stronghold could still produce leaders of extraordinary ability. Alexios rebuilt the military forces, reformed the administration, and even managed to recover some territory from the Turks. When he appealed to Europe for military assistance in opposition to the Muslim threat, he triggered the crusading movement that would dominate the following 200 years of Mediterranean history. Both opportunity and danger came to the imperial seat with the First Crusade. Crusading armies that gathered in the stronghold represented the largest military force ever assembled, but they also posed a threat to imperial sovereignty. Alexios managed the delicate task of using crusader military power to recover lost territories, while preventing crusaders from conquering imperial lands for themselves. Establishment of crusader states in Syria and Palestine provided buffer zones in opposition to Muslim expansion, while opening opportunities for diplomacy and trade. final flowering of imperial culture centered on the Queen of Cities characterized the 1200 years, rivaling that of any European king in its splendor and sophistication. The court of Manuel I Komnenos reflected a complex ruler who combined traditional learning with appreciation for chivalric culture. He married a princess from the Latin regions, welcomed knights to his court, and even considered reuniting the Orthodox and Catholic churches under papal authority. Construction of magnificent buildings distinguished Manuel's reign, including renovation of the Great Palace and rebuilding of several major churches. Works of art that combined traditional techniques with influences from both the Islamic sphere and Europe were created by the city's artisans, maintaining the stronghold's role as a center of international learning. Scholars at the university translated Arabic and Latin texts into Greek. Beneath this glittering surface, however, fundamental problems were weakening the state. Strain on the royal treasury came from the cost of maintaining armies capable of competing with both Turkish Muslims and European crusaders. Privileges granted to Italian merchants had created a situation where foreigners controlled much of the empire's trade. Most dangerously, religious and cultural differences between Greeks and Europeans were creating tensions that diplomatic marriages and theological negotiations could not resolve. Fragility of the Komnenian restoration was exposed by Manuel I's death. His successors lacked his political skill and military ability, while the state faced threats from all directions. Bulgars and Serbs asserted their independence in the Balkans. Turkish emirates pressed closer to the imperial seat from the east. Most ominously, deterioration of the relationship between East and West accelerated as trade disputes combined with religious differences to create an explosive mixture. Depth of popular resentment toward Latin influence was revealed in the massacre of Latins, when a mob turned on Italian merchants and their families, killing thousands and destroying property worth millions of gold pieces. They made reconciliation with Europe almost impossible. Europeans who had once seen the stronghold as an exotic but Christian ally now viewed it as a hostile and heretical enemy. Beginning with the stated goal of recapturing Jerusalem, the Fourth Crusade became instead the instrument of the imperial seat's greatest humiliation. When the crusading army found itself unable to pay the Venetians for transportation to the Holy Land, Doge Enrico Dandolo saw an opportunity to settle old scores. Diversion of the crusade, first to Zara and then to the Queen of Cities, transformed what should have been a holy war in opposition to Islam into a Christian civil war. Investment of the stronghold revealed that even the massive Theodosian fortifications could not protect the city when enemies combined maritime power with intimate knowledge of imperial weaknesses. When crusaders breached the sea barrier along the Golden Horn and forced their way into the urban center, they brought to an end 900 years of unbroken imperial rule over the seat of power. One of the most devastating cultural disasters of medieval history followed in the sack that ensued. Crusaders, who had taken vows to protect Christian holy places, systematically looted the greatest Christian stronghold anywhere. Torn apart for its precious metals, Hagia Sophia's altar suffered desecration, while relics accumulated over hundreds of years were scattered or destroyed. Libraries containing unique manuscripts were burned for fuel. Artistic treasures that represented the highest achievements of imperial civilization were melted down or shipped to Europe as loot. When immediate fury of conquest subsided, the Queen of Cities found itself the seat of a Latin dominion, ruled by European nobles who understood neither the urban center's traditions nor the empire's needs. Dwindling to perhaps 50,000 souls, The population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands left entire quarters abandoned. Forums that had once teemed with merchants from throughout the known sphere echoed with emptiness. Even in this darkest hour, however, the spirit that had created the stronghold endured. In Nicaea, beyond the Bosphorus, imperial nobles established a government in exile that maintained the traditions of the state and prepared for eventual restoration. Though it had suffered a devastating blow, the dream of Rome reborn had not died. 57 years of Crusader rule transformed the Queen of Cities from the greatest metropolis of the Christian world into a pale shadow of its former glory. Baldwin of Flanders, crowned as the first Latin sovereign in Hagia Sophia, inherited not a state but fragments, isolated provinces surrounded by hostile populations who remembered the rapacious invaders with burning hatred. Venice had secured the most profitable portions of the former eastern domains for herself, taking control of key harbours and trade routes while leaving the Catholic rulers with the expensive burden of defence. Across the Sea of Marmara in Nicaea, Theodore I Lascaris established what he claimed was the legitimate continuation of the Roman government. Though controlling only a small portion of Western Anatolia, this administration in exile maintained all the ceremonial dignity of the old regime. Crowned by the patriarch who had fled the metropolis rather than serve under Latin rule, Theodore and his successors kept alive the dream of restoration while building a surprisingly effective kingdom from the ruins of the old order. Meanwhile, in Epirus, another branch of the eastern nobility established a rival claimant government under Michael I Angelus. Far to the south, the despotate of the Morea controlled much of the Peloponnese, while various islands remained under different forms of Byzantine rule. What had once been a unified dominion, stretching across 3 continents, now existed as scattered fragments, each claiming legitimacy while lacking the power to enforce their claims beyond their immediate borders. Life in occupied territories proved harsh for the local populace. European nobles, installed as feudal lords over lands they barely understood, imposed alien customs and Catholic religious practices on Eastern communities. Monasteries were dissolved or given to Crusader religious orders. Ancient privileges were revoked. Trade networks that had operated for centuries were disrupted as Venetian and Genoese merchants redirected commerce to benefit their home cities rather than the local economy. The Latin regime, despite its initial conquest success, proved incapable of effective governance. The knights who had conquered the great metropolis understood warfare and cavalry charges, but they knew nothing of the complex diplomatic, commercial, and administrative traditions that had sustained the Eastern state for 8 centuries. Revenue declined catastrophically as trade shifted to benefit Italian merchants, while the costs of defense against multiple hostile neighbors drained what resources remained. In Nicaea, however, a remarkable revival was taking place. John III Ducas Vatatzes, who became ruler in the 1220s, proved himself one of the most capable sovereigns of the medieval period. Rather than simply maintaining the old traditions, he actively reformed and strengthened his truncated dominion. Agriculture was encouraged through tax incentives. New industries were established to replace goods previously imported from the lost provinces. Armed forces were reorganized and equipped with the latest weapons and tactics. Most importantly, Vatatzes understood that restoration could not be achieved through warfare alone. He cultivated alliances with Bulgaria and the emerging Serbian principalities, creating a network of Eastern Christian states united in their opposition to Crusader rule. Diplomatic missions were sent to the Muslim rulers of Anatolia, who proved willing to cooperate against their common Latin enemies. Even more remarkably, treaties were negotiated with the Mongols, whose vast empire was beginning to threaten the entire region. While the Nicene government grew stronger, the occupying regime grew progressively weaker. Baldwin II, the last Crusader sovereign, spent most of his reign traveling through Europe, begging for financial and military assistance that never came in sufficient quantities. The great metropolis itself became a shadow of its former self, with whole quarters abandoned and many of the magnificent buildings constructed over the centuries falling into decay through simple neglect. Religious tensions added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. The local Christians had never accepted the authority of the Latin Patriarch installed in Hagia Sophia, while efforts to force church union under papal supremacy met with passive resistance throughout the occupied regions. These religious divisions made effective governance nearly impossible, as the ruled populace remained fundamentally hostile to their conquerors. Economic decline accelerated as the decades passed. The sophisticated manufacturing industries that had once supplied goods throughout the Mediterranean relocated to Italian cities or simply disappeared entirely. The great forums and markets that had bustled with international commerce echoed nearly empty. Even the famous silk industry, a closely guarded monopoly for centuries, withered as the techniques and materials were lost or stolen by European competitors. Defensive weakness became increasingly apparent as the Crusader forces proved unable to defend their scattered holdings against determined enemies. Bulgarian armies raided deep into Thrace. Turkish emirates pressed against the Anatolian frontiers. Most dangerously, the Nicene forces, strengthened by years of careful preparation, began probing the defenses around the great city itself. John III Vatatzes launched a systematic campaign to recover the lost provinces, combining military pressure with diplomatic isolation of the occupying regime. One by one, the fortified cities of western Anatolia returned to Byzantine control. Islands in the Aegean were recaptured by the Nicaean navy. Most significantly, alliances with Bulgaria cut the land routes between the metropolis and the Latin holdings in central Greece, leaving the urban centre increasingly isolated. Cultural and intellectual life during the occupation period reflected the broader decline. The university, which had been one of the glories of the old regime, virtually ceased to function as scholars fled to Nicaea or other eastern territories. Libraries were neglected or actively damaged, as Crusader clerics showed little interest in preserving manuscripts they could not read. The tradition of historical writing, which had produced masterworks like those of Procopius and Psellus, almost disappeared entirely. In the scattered Byzantine regions, however, a remarkable cultural renaissance was taking place. Nicene scholars, conscious that they were preserving the authentic traditions of the Eastern state, threw themselves into copying and preserving ancient texts. New theological works were produced that defended traditional positions against Latin innovations. Even in the reduced circumstances of exile, the court maintained traditions of learning and artistic patronage that kept alive the essential character of Byzantine civilization. Theodore II Lascaris, who succeeded his father John III, proved to be not only a capable ruler, but also a distinguished scholar and writer. His letters and philosophical works demonstrated that intellectual sophistication could survive even in greatly reduced circumstances. More practically, he continued his father's policies of military and diplomatic preparation for the eventual reclamation of the metropolis. The opportunity for reclamation came sooner than anyone might have expected. Michael VIII Palaiologos, who had risen to power in Nicaea through a combination of martial skill and political cunning, launched the final campaign against the occupying regime. Rather than attempting a costly assault on the massive Theodosian fortifications, he relied on intelligence networks within the great city itself and the cooperation of the local Christians who had never accepted Latin rule. On July 25th, 1261, Nicaean forces under Alexios Strategopoulos entered the metropolis through the cooperation of Byzantine sympathizers within the garrison. The Crusader sovereign Baldwin II fled so hastily that he left behind the crown jewels and most of the royal regalia. After 57 years of occupation, the Queen of Cities had returned to Eastern hands. Michael VIII's triumphal entry into the reclaimed metropolis marked the beginning of the Palaiologos dynasty, which would rule for the remaining 2 centuries of the state's existence. The government that had been reclaimed was dramatically different from the one that had been lost. The citizenry of the great city had fallen to perhaps a tenth of its former size. Vast areas of the urban space lay in ruins. The economic networks that had once made the metropolis the commercial hub of the Mediterranean had been permanently disrupted. More fundamentally, the balance of power in the region had shifted decisively during the Latin interregnum. Venice and Genoa now controlled most of the profitable Mediterranean trade routes. The emerging Turkish Beylik in northwestern Anatolia was rapidly expanding its reach and influence. Bulgaria had become a major regional power, while Serbia was asserting its independence under the ambitious Nemanjic dynasty. The reclaimed eastern state found itself surrounded by rivals and possessing only a fraction of its former resources. Michael VIII proved to be a ruler of remarkable energy and diplomatic skill, but even his abilities could not fully compensate for the structural weaknesses of the renewed regime. The treasury was chronically empty, forcing the sovereign to devalue the currency repeatedly. The armed forces, though reorganized along more modern lines, lacked the resources to defend the scattered holdings effectively. Most problematically, the social and economic foundations that had sustained the old order had been permanently damaged. Religious policy presented particular challenges for the renewed administration. Michael VIII, recognizing the defensive weakness of his position, attempted to negotiate church union with Rome in hopes of securing European support against the growing Turkish threat. The Union of Lyon, proclaimed in 1274, officially reunited the Eastern and Catholic churches under papal authority, but it was widely rejected by both clergy and citizens in the Byzantine territories. Popular resistance to the union policy created internal tensions that weakened the state just when unity was most needed. Monasteries became centers of opposition to the sovereign's religious policies. Riots broke out in the metropolis itself when attempts were made to enforce the union. The local Christians, having endured Crusader rule for more than half a century, had no desire to accept papal supremacy, even as a diplomatic expedient. Combat challenges multiplied as the 13th century progressed. Charles of Anjou, the ambitious ruler of southern Italy and Sicily, assembled a formidable coalition aimed at reimposing Latin rule over the eastern territories. Only the famous Sicilian Vespers uprising, which destroyed Angevin power in Sicily, prevented a renewed European invasion. Meanwhile, Turkish raids into the remaining Anatolian holdings increased in frequency and intensity, gradually eroding the territorial base of the renewed government. Economic recovery proved even more difficult than military defense. The sophisticated financial instruments and commercial networks that had once sustained the metropolis's prosperity had been disrupted beyond repair. Italian merchants, now firmly established in their dominant position, showed little interest in returning to the old arrangements that had benefited Byzantine traders. The famous silk industry, symbol of the city's former prosperity, never fully recovered from the disruptions of the occupation period. Diplomatic relations with Europe remained tense throughout Michael VIII's reign. European rulers, particularly those who had invested heavily in the defunct Crusader regime, viewed the reclamation with hostility. The Pope, despite the nominal church union, provided little practical support against the Turkish threat. Most frustratingly, requests for military assistance against the expanding Turkish Beylik were largely ignored by powers who saw the Eastern state as a rival rather than an ally. Social changes during the period of fragmentation and reclamation reflected the broader transformation of Byzantine society. The old aristocratic families that had dominated the pre-1204 order had been scattered or impoverished by the Crusader conquest. New families rose to prominence, often those who had distinguished themselves in military service during the reclamation campaigns. The rigid court ceremonial that had characterized the earlier period gave way to more informal arrangements, reflecting the reduced circumstances of the dynasty. Urban life in the reclaimed metropolis bore little resemblance to the bustling, cosmopolitan atmosphere of the pre-conquest period. Whole quarters remained abandoned and ruined. The inhabitants, drawn largely from the countryside and refugees from lost territories, lacked the commercial skills and international connections that had made the old merchant class so prosperous. Travelers commented on the stark contrast between the magnificence of the surviving monuments and the poverty of the contemporary citizenry. Michael VIII died in 1282, leaving behind a state that had been reclaimed in name but remained fundamentally weakened. His son, Andronikos II, inherited problems that would prove insoluble: an empty treasury, hostile neighbors on all sides, and a people exhausted by constant warfare and economic hardship. The renewed Eastern dominion would survive for nearly 2 more centuries, but it would never again approach the power and prosperity it had enjoyed before the catastrophic Fourth Crusade. Something essential had been preserved through the dark years of Crusader rule and the difficult decades of reclamation. The idea of the Byzantine state, the notion that this particular form of Eastern civilization represented something unique and valuable, had survived conquest, occupation, and exile. In Nicaea and the other Eastern regions, scholars and administrators had maintained the essential traditions of governance, learning, and religious practice that defined Byzantine identity. As the 13th century drew to a close, however, new challenges were emerging that would prove even more dangerous than the Crusader conquest. In northwestern Anatolia, a Turkish tribal leader named Osman was beginning to unite the various Turkish groups under his leadership. This emerging beylik, as it would come to be known, combined traditional Turkish martial skills with sophisticated administrative techniques learned from their Byzantine and Muslim neighbors. Unlike previous Turkish groups, which had been content with raiding and tribute, these new forces showed clear ambitions for permanent territorial conquest and governance. The stage was being set for the final phase of the Eastern states' long history, a period in which the reclaimed government would face an enemy more formidable than any it had previously encountered. An enemy that combined the combat effectiveness of the old Turkish raiders with the administrative sophistication of a true kingdom. The dream of New Rome had survived the Crusader conquest, but it would face its ultimate test in the centuries to come. In the highlands of northwestern Anatolia, where Greek farmlands gave way to pastoral nomad camps, a new power was stirring that would reshape the world. Osman Gazi, leader of a modest Turkish beylik, had begun something that his descendants would transform into the greatest Islamic force since the early Arab conquests. What started as a collection of warrior bands seeking pasture and plunder gradually evolved into a sophisticated state that combined the martial traditions of the steppes with the administrative wisdom of settled civilizations. The descendants of Osman, named for their founding patriarch, possessed advantages that earlier Turkish groups had lacked. Unlike the Seljuks, who had conquered vast territories only to see them fragment among quarreling successors, this dynasty developed institutions capable of sustained governance. They learned from their Greek subjects how to administer cities and collect taxes efficiently. From their Muslim neighbors came legal traditions and religious scholarship. Most importantly, they created a unique military system that could both expand their borders and consolidate their conquests. Orhan Gazi, Osman's son, established the foundations of Turkish greatness during his long reign in the 14th century. He transformed what had been a loose confederation of tribal warriors into a disciplined force capable of sophisticated operations. The capture of Bursa provided this emerging power with its first major urban center, complete with workshops, markets, and the infrastructure necessary for a settled government. More significantly, Orhan began the systematic recruitment of young men who would become the legendary Janissary Corps. This devshirme system represented a revolutionary approach to military organization. Young boys, primarily from Balkan families, were taken to serve the Sultan's court, where they received intensive education in Islamic law, Turkish language, and martial arts. Unlike traditional slave soldiers, these recruits could rise to the highest positions in the state, based on merit rather than birth. The Janissaries who emerged from this system combined absolute loyalty to the Sultan with professional competence that made them arguably the finest infantry force in the world. Across the narrow Dardanelles, the restored Greek administration watched these developments with growing alarm. The Palaiologos dynasty, despite the heroic efforts of Michael VIII and his successors, found itself caught between the advancing Turks to the east and an increasingly hostile Latin Europe to the west. Attempts to secure papal support through church union had alienated the population without producing meaningful military assistance. Venice and Genoa, the dominant maritime powers, showed more interest in profitable trade arrangements with the emerging Turkish state than in defending Eastern Christianity. Murad I, who succeeded Orhan in the 1360s, proved to be the ruler who transformed a regional power into a European force. His armies crossed into the Balkans, establishing a permanent foothold on European soil that would endure for more than 5 centuries. The victory at Kosovo in 1389, though costly, eliminated Serbian independence and opened the path to further expansion northward. More ominously for the Greek capital, these forces now controlled both sides of the Dardanelles, effectively encircling the remaining fragments of the Old Dominion. The speed of Turkish expansion reflected not just martial prowess, but also administrative genius. Conquered populations found this new rule often preferable to the chaotic conditions that had prevailed under their previous masters. Religious minorities received protection under Islamic law. Trade flourished under efficient administration. Perhaps most importantly, the Turks demonstrated a talent for incorporating the best elements of conquered civilizations into their own system, rather than simply imposing their customs everywhere. Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt for the speed of his campaigns, brought this expanding power to the very gates of the Queen of Cities for the first time. His investment of the great metropolis in the early 15th century, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that the massive Theodosian fortifications could no longer guarantee the capital's safety. Only the timely arrival of Tamerlane's Mongol forces, which destroyed Bayezid's army at Ankara in 1402, saved the Greek dominion from conquest a century and a half before its actual fall. The civil war that followed Ankara, known as the Interregnum, provided the Greek administration with its last realistic opportunity to recover lost ground. For more than a decade, Turkish princes fought among themselves for control of their father's inheritance, while their former subjects rebelled and their enemies pressed in from all sides. The weakness of the restored Greek state was revealed by its inability to take meaningful advantage of this situation. A few coastal cities were recovered, but the fundamental balance of power remained unchanged. Meanwhile, in Hungary, a different kind of resistance to Turkish expansion was taking shape. John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Wallachia, emerged as the most effective European military commander of his generation. His victories at Belgrade and other battles proved that Turkish forces were not invincible, inspiring hope throughout Europe that the advance could be stopped. The Hungarian kingdom, with its strategic position controlling the Danube Valley, became the primary bulwark against further expansion into Central Europe. The relationship between the Greek state and these Latin powers remained complex and often counterproductive. Religious differences that had festered since the Fourth Crusade made genuine cooperation difficult. The Council of Florence in 1439, which proclaimed the union of the Eastern and Catholic churches under papal authority, was widely rejected by the Greek clergy and population. This religious division fatally weakened resistance just when unity was most desperately needed. Murad II, who eventually emerged victorious from the civil war, proved to be an even more formidable ruler than his predecessors. He combined his father's military brilliance with a deeper understanding of statecraft and diplomacy. The reconstruction of Turkish power after the disasters of the Interregnum demonstrated the resilience of the institutions that previous rulers had created. More ominously, Murad showed a particular interest in artillery technologies that were beginning to revolutionize military operations. The investment of Thessalonica, the second metropolis of the Greek state, provided a preview of Turkish capabilities under Murad II's leadership. The urban center's formidable walls, which had protected it for centuries, proved inadequate against cannon and mining operations. When Thessalonica fell in 1430, it was clear that traditional fortifications alone could no longer guarantee security. The implications for the capital, despite its superior defenses, were ominous. Hungarian resistance reached its climax with the Crusade of Varna in 1444. King Vladislav III of Poland and Hungary, supported by papal financing and Genoese naval power, assembled the largest European army to face the Turks since the early Crusades. The young king's army included Hungarian heavy cavalry, Polish knights, Wallachian irregulars, and a contingent of volunteers who saw this campaign as a chance to win glory in defense of Christendom. John Hunyadi's tactical brilliance nearly achieved a stunning victory at Varna. His carefully coordinated attack broke the Turkish center and seemed poised to rout Murad II's entire army. The impetuous charge of King Vladislav III against Hunyadi's explicit orders led to the young monarch's death and the collapse of morale. The Turkish recovery and subsequent victory eliminated the last serious threat to their European expansion for generations. The aftermath of Varna reverberated throughout Europe. The death of Vladislav III left Hungary weakened and divided. Polish support for anti-Turkish campaigns evaporated. Most significantly, European enthusiasm for crusading against the Turks largely disappeared, as rulers focused on more immediate concerns closer to home. The Greek state found itself more isolated than ever, surrounded by Turkish holdings and abandoned by potential allies. Turkish society, during this period of expansion, developed characteristics that would define it for centuries. The palace school in Adrianople became a center of learning that rivaled any institution in Europe or the Islamic world. architects began developing the distinctive style that would culminate in the great mosques of Sinan. Perhaps most importantly, this emerging power demonstrated an unusual capacity for religious tolerance that enabled them to govern diverse populations effectively. The Devshirme system reached its full development under Murad II, providing the administration with a steady stream of talented officials and military officers. These palace-trained administrators, owing their positions entirely to the Sultan's favor, created a governing class that was both highly competent and absolutely loyal. The contrast with the corrupt and factional court politics that plagued most contemporary European kingdoms was stark and contributed significantly to Turkish success. Murad II's abdication in favor of his young son, Mehmed, in 1444, seemed to offer the Greek state a respite from Turkish pressure. The new sultan was only 12 years old, and his inexperience encouraged rebellion throughout the domains. The Janissaries themselves forced the young ruler to recall his father from retirement to deal with the crisis. This apparent weakness masked the remarkable character and abilities of the future conqueror. Mehmed II, even as a child, demonstrated an intellectual curiosity and strategic vision that surpassed most adult rulers of his time. He mastered not only Turkish and Arabic, but also Persian, Greek, and Latin. His tutors included some of the finest scholars of the age, both Muslim and European. Most significantly, he developed an obsession with the great metropolis across the Bosphorus that would define his entire reign. When Murad II died in 1451 and Mehmed ascended the throne for the second time, he was no longer an inexperienced youth, but a young man of 19 who had already demonstrated his capabilities. His first acts as sultan revealed both his ambitions and his methods. Rather than immediately launching military campaigns, he spent months consolidating his position, eliminating potential rivals, and preparing for the great enterprise that would make his name immortal. The construction of Rumeli Hisar, the fortress that controlled the European shore of the Bosphorus, announced Mehmed's intentions more clearly than any declaration of war. This massive fortification, built in record time using forced labor from throughout the domains, gave the Turks complete control over maritime traffic between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. More symbolically, it demonstrated that the new sultan possessed both the vision and the resources necessary to attempt what his predecessors had not achieved. Turkish military technology had advanced dramatically during Murad II's reign. The Janissary Corps now numbered in the thousands and was equipped with the finest firearms available. More importantly, foundries had begun producing artillery pieces that rivaled anything in Europe. The recruitment of Urban, a Hungarian engineer who had been refused employment by the Greek administration, provided the Turks with perhaps the most skilled cannon maker of his generation. Intelligence networks developed during decades of expansion gave Mehmed detailed knowledge of conditions within the great metropolis. Merchants, diplomats, and spies had mapped every street and identified every weakness in the ancient defenses. The Sultan knew exactly how many soldiers defended the capital, what resources were available for its defense, and which members of the Greek court might be willing to cooperate with new masters. Diplomatic isolation of the Greek state was nearly complete by 1451. Venice, despite its nominal Christianity, maintained profitable trade relations with the Turks and showed no interest in jeopardizing these arrangements for the sake of solidarity. Genoa's position was even more compromised, as their colony at Galata, directly across the Golden Horn from the capital, made them hostages to Turkish goodwill. Hungary, the only European power with both the capability and motivation to provide meaningful assistance, was too distant and too preoccupied with its own defensive needs. The religious situation within the Greek state itself had been poisoned by decades of conflict over union with Rome. The population remained overwhelmingly opposed to papal authority, viewing attempts at religious compromise as betrayal of their most fundamental beliefs. Without European support, the chances of successful resistance to Turkish conquest appeared minimal. This theological deadlock paralyzed the administration just when decisive action was most needed. Economic conditions in the capital reflected the broader decline of the Greek state. The population had fallen to perhaps 50,000 souls, rattling around in an urban space designed for 10 times that number. Whole quarters lay abandoned, their buildings slowly crumbling from neglect. The famous silk industry had virtually disappeared, unable to compete with Turkish and Italian producers. Even basic maintenance of the infrastructure had become difficult as tax revenues continued to decline. Something of the old grandeur remained. Hagia Sophia still soared above the Golden Horn, its dome a symbol of resistance to Islamic expansion. The court, though reduced in circumstances, maintained the ceremonial traditions that connected it to Constantine the Great and Justinian. Most importantly, the population retained a sense of identity and purpose that would make them formidable opponents when the final test came. As 1451 drew to a close, observers throughout Europe recognized that a decisive moment was approaching. The young Turkish Sultan had made his intentions clear through both words and actions. The Greek state, despite its weaknesses, showed no signs of surrendering without a fight. The collision between these two forces, one representing the dynamic expansion of Islam, the other the stubborn survival of Eastern Rome, would determine not just the fate of a single metropolis, but the future balance of power between East and West. Mehmed II spent the winter months of 1451 to 1452 in careful preparation for the enterprise that would define his reign. Every detail was planned with meticulous care. The positioning of artillery, the coordination of land and naval forces, the timing of the assault itself. The Sultan understood that he would have only one opportunity to achieve his goal. Failure would not only destroy his personal reputation, but might fatally weaken the Turkish state itself. In the great metropolis, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos prepared for what he knew might be the final confrontation. The last ruler of the Romans faced his destiny with a mixture of resignation and determination that would make him a figure of legend. The stage was set for one of history's most momentous clashes, a struggle that would end over 1,000 years of Roman continuity and herald the beginning of a new age in world history. Constantine XI Palaiologos had never intended to be the final sovereign of the Roman line. Born the fourth son of Manuel II, he had grown to manhood expecting to govern some distant province, while his elder brothers inherited the purple and the burden of defending the ancient realm. Death and circumstance had cleared his path to a throne that few men would have wanted, bringing with it responsibilities that would have crushed lesser spirits. At 53, the emperor possessed the weathered dignity of a man who had spent decades confronting impossible odds. His face bore the lines of someone who had watched Turkish raiders burn Orthodox villages, who had negotiated desperately for aid that never came in sufficient measure, who had witnessed the slow hemorrhaging of the last fragments of Roman territory. His dark eyes retained a spark of determination that suggested he would not surrender his inheritance without extracting the highest possible price from those who sought to claim it. The metropolis he ruled bore little resemblance to the glittering urban centre that had once commanded 3 continents. Grass grew in the hippodrome, where 100,000 spectators had once cheered the chariot races. Magnificent palaces stood empty, their marble halls echoing with memories of vanished glory. Entire districts lay abandoned, their houses slowly crumbling as nature reclaimed what human ambition had built. The population that remained, perhaps 50,000 souls in a space designed for 500,000, clustered around the harbours and the great church, leaving vast areas of the urban landscape to decay. What remained was still magnificent enough to inspire awe in foreign visitors. Hagia Sophia continued to dominate the skyline, its great dome a testament to human aspiration and divine inspiration. The Theodosian fortifications, though requiring constant maintenance that strained the treasury, still presented a formidable barrier to any attacker. Most importantly, the spirit that had created this greatest of cities endured in its people, who called themselves Romans, with the same pride their ancestors had felt when the purple banners flew over Egypt and Syria. The imperial court reflected both the dignity of ancient tradition and the stark reality of contemporary circumstances. The ceremonies that had once required hundreds of participants were now performed by a handful of elderly officials who remembered better days. Regalia that had been crafted for rulers of vast territories now adorned a sovereign whose actual domain extended little beyond the urban perimeter. These rituals continued, maintaining the unbroken chain of legitimacy that stretched back through the mists of time to Augustus himself. The sovereign's greatest challenge was not defending ancient ramparts or maintaining empty ceremonies, but navigating the treacherous currents of religious politics that threatened to destroy Orthodox unity in the face of the Turkish threat. The question of union with Rome, which had plagued his predecessors for decades, demanded resolution as Islamic power grew ever more menacing. Any decision risked alienating either the population whose loyalty was essential for defense, or the powers whose military support might prove decisive. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate who arrived in the metropolis in late 1452, embodied both the promise and the peril of assistance from the Latin world. A learned Greek who had embraced papal supremacy, Isidore brought with him both papal authority to proclaim church union and a contingent of soldiers to help defend the realm. His presence forced the emperor to confront the most painful dilemma of his reign, whether to sacrifice the religious independence his people cherished for the military support they desperately needed. The proclamation of union in Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452, marked both a triumph and a tragedy for the last ruler. Triumph because it formally ended the schism that had divided Eastern and Catholic Christianity for 4 centuries. Tragedy because it also divided his own people at the moment when unity was most essential. Many of the clergy refused to participate in the ceremony. Ordinary citizens stayed away from services conducted according to the new arrangements. The famous declaration that it would be better to see the Muslim turban in the midst of the metropolis than the Latin mitre captured the depth of popular opposition to religious compromise. Meanwhile, across the narrow waters of the Bosphorus, Sultan Mehmed II was transforming the Turkish realm into a war machine focused on a single objective. The construction of Rumeli Hisar had been only the beginning of preparations that dwarfed anything previously attempted in the region. Foundries throughout the Islamic domains worked day and night to produce the artillery train that would reduce the ancient fortifications to rubble. The famous Hungarian engineer Urban labored to create the largest cannon ever conceived, a monster that would fire stone balls weighing more than half a ton. Turkish preparations extended far beyond artillery. The Sultan's agents scoured Europe and Asia for specialists, mining experts and professional troops. Timber for scaling ladders and towers was cut in the forests of Anatolia and transported to staging areas around the metropolis. Most ominously, a massive chain was forged to stretch across the Golden Horn, cutting off the harbour that had been the urban centre's lifeline for over 1,000 years. The recruitment of manpower for the coming campaign demonstrated the resources now at Turkish disposal. Janissaries from the elite guard units converged on Adrianople for final training and equipment. Regular troops from across the European and Asian provinces received orders to assemble for what their commanders called the greatest jihad. Volunteer warriors from throughout the Islamic world, drawn by the prospect of participating in the conquest of Christianity's greatest stronghold, swelled the ranks to perhaps 150,000 men. Intelligence gathering had been as thorough as material preparation. Spies had mapped every gate and tower of the Theodosian barriers. They knew the exact number of garrison forces available, the quantity of supplies stockpiled within the metropolis, and the locations where the ancient fortifications were most vulnerable. More importantly, they had identified potential collaborators within the realm itself, merchants who feared for their property, officials who doubted the possibility of successful resistance, and religious figures who had been alienated by the union with Rome. The diplomatic isolation of the Orthodox realm was now virtually complete. Venice, despite its Christian heritage, had negotiated trading privileges with the Turks that made open support for the defense impossible. The Venetian merchants in the metropolis faced an agonizing choice between their faith and their fortunes, knowing that resistance to Islamic conquest would likely result in the loss of both. Genoa's position was even more compromised, as their colony at Galata made them effective hostages to Turkish goodwill. European powers showed little interest in providing meaningful assistance to the embattled realm. France was preoccupied with the final phases of the 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire faced pressure from Islamic expansion in Hungary. England remained focused on domestic affairs following the Wars of the Roses. Even the papacy, despite its theological commitment to church union, could provide little beyond moral support and the small contingent of troops that accompanied Cardinal Isidore. Hungarian resistance, which had provided the most effective opposition to Turkish expansion, was now focused on defending the Danube frontier rather than distant Orthodox territories. John Hunyadi, though sympathetic to the plight of the last ruler, recognized that his limited resources could not be spared for what appeared to be a hopeless cause. The memory of Varna, where the flower of Hungarian chivalry had perished in a failed attempt to halt Islamic expansion, made further adventurous campaigns politically impossible. Within the metropolis itself, preparation for blockade proceeded under conditions that would have been comic if they had not been so tragic. The treasury could barely afford to pay the few hundred professional soldiers who formed the core of the defense. Weapons had to be purchased from Italian merchants at inflated prices. The great chain that had once protected the Golden Horn from naval attack required repairs that strained both financial resources and engineering capabilities. The spirit of resistance remained strong among those who chose to stay and fight. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese condottiere, who arrived with a small force of professional soldiers, brought not only military expertise, but also the international credibility that legitimized the defense in European eyes. His assessment of the metropolis's defensive capabilities was sobering. The ramparts were strong, but the garrison was woefully inadequate, though his presence demonstrated that some Christians still honored their obligations to defend Christendom. The Orthodox clergy, despite their opposition to union with Rome, rallied to support the defense effort. Monasteries contributed their accumulated treasures to purchase weapons and supplies. Monks joined the civilian volunteers who would man portions of the fortifications during the coming ordeal. Most importantly, religious leaders provided the spiritual leadership that sustained morale among a population that understood they were facing not just conquest, but the end of their entire way of life. Popular resistance to the Turkish threat took forms both practical and symbolic. Citizens melted down jewelry and church ornaments to provide metal for cannon and shot. Families that had preserved ancient traditions through centuries of decline now prepared to sacrifice everything rather than submit to foreign rule. Children were sent away to distant relatives, while their parents remained to face whatever fate awaited the realm. The winter months of 1452 to 1453 witnessed a curious calm before the storm. Turkish and Orthodox forces maintained an uneasy coexistence, with merchants continuing to trade across the lines and diplomats exchanging messages about possible terms for surrender. Everyone understood that these negotiations were merely formalities. Mehmed II had committed too much prestige and too many resources to accept anything less than unconditional surrender, while the emperor had made clear that he would never abandon the metropolis his ancestors had ruled for over 1,000 years. As spring approached, the tempo of Turkish preparations increased dramatically. Artillery pieces were moved into position along the landward side of the realm. Engineers began the complex calculations necessary to coordinate a simultaneous assault from multiple directions. Most ominously, the massive naval force that had been assembled in the Sea of Marmara began moving toward the approaches to the Golden Horn. The final diplomatic exchange between the two rulers captured the essence of their respective positions. Mehmed's demand for surrender was phrased in the formal language of Islamic law, offering the population safety in exchange for submission. The emperor's response, equally formal, rejected any compromise that would end the Roman line or surrender the metropolis that bore the name of Constantine the Great. Both men understood that they were not merely exchanging ultimatums, but making statements for the judgment of history. Religious observances in the realm took on an increasingly desperate character as the Turkish army drew closer. Processions bearing the most sacred relics wound through streets that might soon echo with the tread of foreign soldiers. In Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic clergy attempted to maintain the union that most of the population rejected, while outside its sacred precincts, citizens prepared for an ordeal that would test not only their military capabilities, but their fundamental beliefs about divine protection and human destiny. The psychological preparation for the coming trial was perhaps as important as the material arrangements. The emperor addressed his people not as subjects, but as fellow Romans who shared responsibility for preserving something precious that had been entrusted to their care. He reminded them that they were the inheritors of a tradition that stretched back through the centuries to the first Christian ruler, and that their resistance would be remembered long after the outcome of the conflict had been decided. As March gave way to April, the last diplomatic missions departed the metropolis, carrying messages to courts that would arrive too late to influence events. The great gates were sealed and barricaded. The harbour chain was secured in position. Watchmen took their posts on the highest towers to scan the horizon for the first sight of Turkish banners. In 1,000 small ways, the greatest urban centre of the medieval world prepared to face its final test. The arrival of the Turkish vanguard on April 2nd, 1453, marked the beginning of the end for the longest surviving remnant of the Roman world. As Islamic horsemen appeared on the hills overlooking the realm, citizens gathered on the ramparts to witness the approach of destiny. Some wept for what was about to be lost. Others prayed for divine intervention. All understood that they were about to participate in events that would echo through the centuries, whatever their outcome. The last sovereign of the Romans stood on the fortifications of his ancestors, watching the banners of Islam spread across the landscape that had once been the heartland of Christian dominion. At 53, this final ruler faced the greatest challenge of a life that had known few easy moments. Behind him lay 11 centuries of Christian rule over the Queen of Cities. Before him stretched 53 days that would determine whether that tradition would continue or become merely another chapter in the long history of fallen realms. Dawn of April 6th broke to the sound that would define the next 53 days, the thunderous roar of Urban's great bombard, speaking its message of destruction across the ancient fortifications. The Hungarian engineer's masterpiece, a bronze monster 27 feet long and requiring a crew of hundreds to operate, hurled its first stone ball against the ramparts that had protected the Queen of Cities for over 1,000 years. The impact shook buildings throughout the capital and announced to protector and citizen alike that this ordeal would be unlike any that had come before. The Turkish artillery train represented the most concentrated firepower ever assembled in medieval warfare. Beyond Urban's giant cannon, dozens of smaller pieces lined the landward approach to the metropolis, their bronze mouths pointing toward barriers that had turned back Attila the Hun and Arab caliphs. Each day brought a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction, as stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds crashed into masonry that had weathered earthquakes and centuries. The ancient alternating courses of brick and stone, designed to absorb shock, cracked and crumbled under impacts that would have been unimaginable to the original builders. Sultan Mehmed II established his headquarters on the hill overlooking the Lycus Valley, where the land fortifications descended toward the Golden Horn. From this vantage point, the young conqueror could observe every aspect of the campaign, while remaining close enough to the front lines to inspire his troops by his presence. His scarlet and gold pavilion, surrounded by the banners of provinces from the Danube to the Euphrates, became the nerve center for operations that involved coordinating land and naval forces across multiple fronts. Within the beleaguered metropolis, Emperor Constantine XI faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most rulers. His total garrison numbered perhaps 7,000 men, a pitifully small force to defend fortifications that stretched for miles. Professional soldiers formed only a tiny core of this defense. The majority consisted of citizens who had never held weapons in anger, monks who had exchanged prayer books for swords, and foreign merchants who had chosen to risk everything rather than abandon their adopted home. Giovanni Giustiniani emerged as the soul of the resistance, his expertise and leadership transforming a desperate situation into organized defiance. The Genoese condottiere established his command post at the critical section of the land barriers known as the Mes Taikion, where the main Turkish assault would inevitably fall. His engineers worked frantically to repair damage from the daily bombardment, using timber, earth, and rubble to shore up breaches that appeared faster than they could be sealed. The great boom chain that stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn represented both the strongest element of the defensive system and its most vulnerable point. This massive barrier of iron links, supported by floating timber, had protected the harbour from naval attack for generations. Islamic ships crowded the Sea of Marmara beyond the chain, their captains testing its strength while seeking any weakness that might allow them to force an entrance to the harbour beyond. Yet Mehmed II possessed resources and imagination that previous besiegers had lacked. When direct assault on the boom proved impossible, the Sultan conceived an operation that would rank among the most audacious in military history. Throughout the night of April 21st, teams of oxen and hundreds of labourers dragged 70 Turkish ships overland from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn, bypassing the boom entirely and establishing a naval presence in the harbour that had been considered impregnable. This maritime coup de main transformed the strategic situation overnight. Orthodox protectors, who had concentrated their limited forces on the land barriers, now faced attacks from the seaside as well. More critically, the appearance of enemy vessels in the Golden Horn demoralized the population, who had believed their harbour sanctuary inviolable. Citizens who gazed out from their windows to see hostile ships, where only friendly merchant vessels had sailed, felt their world turning upside down. Daily life within the besieged capital took on a surreal quality, as normal routines continued amid extraordinary circumstances. Markets still operated, though with diminishing supplies and soaring prices. Children still played in the streets, though their games now involved dodging fragments from cannonballs. Churches held services that combined traditional liturgies with desperate prayers for divine intervention, while outside their sacred spaces, the methodical work of destruction continued without pause. The bombardment followed a relentless schedule that wore down both stone and human endurance. Each morning brought renewed thunder as Turkish artillery resumed its systematic assault on the fortifications. Those manning the ramparts who had worked through the night to repair previous damage watched helplessly as fresh impacts undid their labor. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the physical destruction, as citizens who had never doubted the strength of their barriers saw them reduced to rubble before their eyes. Food supplies, carefully hoarded in anticipation of blockade, began to dwindle as the weeks passed. Bread became a luxury, available only to those with sufficient coin. Vegetables disappeared from the markets entirely. Even fish, traditionally abundant in the waters around the metropolis, became scarce as Turkish naval patrols restricted access to traditional fishing grounds. Hunger joined fear as a constant companion for the civilian population. Religious fervor reached fever pitch as the ordeal progressed. Processions bearing the most sacred relics wound through streets that echoed with cannon fire. The robe of the Virgin, preserved in the Blackenay Palace for centuries, was carried along the battlements in hopes that divine protection might strengthen human defenses. In Hagia Sophia, Orthodox and Catholic clergy struggled to maintain the unity proclaimed the previous winter, while popular resentment against the union with Rome grew stronger with each passing day. Turkish mining operations beneath the land fortifications added a new dimension of terror to the investment. Sappers, many of them experienced miners from Serbia and Bosnia, dug tunnels designed to collapse sections of the barriers. The garrison responded with countermines, leading to subterranean battles fought in darkness by men who could barely see their enemies. The sound of digging became another source of anxiety for citizens who never knew when the ground beneath their feet might suddenly give way. Greek fire made its final appearance in military history during these desperate weeks. The secret incendiary weapon that had saved the metropolis from Arab fleets centuries earlier proved effective against Turkish ships in the Golden Horn, sending several vessels up in flames that could be seen for miles. Yet the city's protectors possessed only limited quantities of this ancient weapon, and its impact, though spectacular, could not alter the fundamental balance of forces. Women played crucial roles in the resistance that went far beyond traditional support functions. They carried water and ammunition to the ramparts under fire, nursed wounded soldiers in improvised hospitals, and in some cases took up arms themselves when sections of the fortifications were temporarily undermanned. Noble ladies sold their jewelry to purchase gunpowder, while common women melted down kitchen implements to provide metal for shot. The morale of the Turkish forces fluctuated as the campaign dragged on longer than expected. The massive artillery bombardment, while impressively destructive, had not yet created breaches large enough for a successful assault. Casualties mounted among the troops as the garrison contested every advance. Some of the Sultan's advisors, particularly the experienced vizier Halil Pasha, began advocating for a negotiated settlement that would save face while avoiding the costs of a prolonged investment. Mehmed II, however, remained adamant that only complete conquest would satisfy his ambitions. The young sultan understood that his reputation and the future of his dynasty depended on success in this enterprise. Retreat or compromise would be seen as weakness throughout the Islamic world and might encourage rebellion among his Christian subjects. The campaign had become a test not just of military capabilities, but of willpower and determination. Intelligence networks operated by both sides provided crucial information about enemy intentions and capabilities. Turkish spies within the metropolis reported on morale, supplies, and defensive preparations. Orthodox agents among the Islamic forces gathered details about planned assaults and identified potential weaknesses in the besieging army. This shadow war of information proved almost as important as the visible conflict being fought on the battlements. The famous Hungarian cannon that had announced the beginning of the ordeal became both symbol and victim of the artillery war. Urban's masterpiece, though devastatingly effective, suffered from the technological limitations of 15th century metallurgy. Repeated firing caused stress fractures in the bronze barrel, while the enormous charges required for maximum range gradually weakened the weapon's structure. When the great gun finally exploded, killing Urban and his entire crew, it marked both a tactical setback for the attackers and the end of an era in warfare. Weather became an additional factor as spring rains turned the ground around the barriers into mud that hindered both attack and defense. Turkish troops struggled to move artillery and supplies through terrain that resembled a swamp. The garrison found their own movement restricted, as flooding in the lower areas of the metropolis made some defensive positions untenable. Both armies learned to time their operations around natural conditions that neither could control. Diplomatic efforts continued, even as military operations intensified. Genoese merchants from Galata attempted to mediate between the two sides, though their proposals fell far short of either party's minimum demands. Venetian representatives explored possibilities for negotiated surrender that might preserve at least some autonomy for the Orthodox population. Yet these discussions served mainly to delay the inevitable, rather than offering realistic alternatives to military conquest. The psychological war proved as important as artillery bombardment in wearing down defensive resolve. Turkish heralds proclaimed the Sultan's terms for surrender, promising safety for those who submitted while threatening destruction for continued resistance. Orthodox clergy responded with sermons that emphasized divine protection and the sacred nature of their cause. Both sides understood that victory would ultimately depend as much on maintaining morale as on tactical success. Religious visions and omens proliferated as the blockade reached its climax. Those manning the ramparts reported seeing the Virgin Mary walking the fortifications, while attackers claimed divine approval for their holy war. A lunar eclipse in late May was interpreted by both Christians and Muslims as a sign of impending victory for their cause. Such supernatural manifestations reflected the enormous psychological pressure under which all participants labored. Supply shortages began affecting the Turkish forces as well as the beleaguered garrison. The massive army required enormous quantities of food, ammunition, and equipment that strained logistics capabilities. Foraging parties ranged ever farther from the investment lines to find provisions, while local populations fled deeper into the countryside to avoid requisitions. Even the Sultan's vast resources showed signs of strain under the demands of maintaining such a large force in the field. As May drew toward its close, both sides recognized that the campaign was approaching its climax, Turkish preparations for a final assault became increasingly obvious as troops were concentrated and equipment positioned for maximum effect. Within the metropolis, the garrison prepared for what they knew might be their last battle, distributing final ammunition reserves and positioning forces for the desperate struggle ahead. Constantine XI addressed his people one final time as emperor and protector, speaking words that would echo through history. He reminded them that they stood at the crossroads of continents and civilizations, guardians of a tradition that stretched back through the centuries to the first Christian emperor. Whether they won or lost, their resistance would be remembered by future generations as an example of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The final night before the assault found the great metropolis wrapped in an eerie calm, broken only by the sounds of preparation on both sides. In Orthodox churches, priests conducted services that might be their last in freedom. On the Turkish lines, commanders issued final orders to troops who had waited weeks for this moment. History held its breath as two worlds prepared to collide in a battle that would determine the fate of the last remnant of Rome. Before dawn broke on Tuesday, May 29th, Sultan Mehmed II stood in his scarlet pavilion, gazing toward the ancient ramparts that had defied conquest for over 1,000 years. At 21, this young conqueror had staked his dynasty's future on these next few hours. Around the Sultan, commanders made final preparations for an assault that would either crown their master as heir to Caesar or destroy his reputation forever. In the pre-dawn darkness, 150,000 warriors prepared to test themselves against 7,000 defenders and the mightiest fortifications ever built. Mehmed's battle plan combined centuries of Islamic military wisdom with innovations learned from European warfare. 3 successive waves would crash against different sections of the Theodosian barriers, each designed to exploit weaknesses created by the previous assault. First would come the irregulars and volunteers, expendable troops whose sacrifice would exhaust the garrison's ammunition and reveal defensive weaknesses. Anatolian regulars would follow, pressing the attack with disciplined fury. Finally, the elite Janissaries would deliver the killing blow through whatever breaches had been created. Across the Golden Horn, Emperor Constantine XI made his own final preparations in the ruins of the Great Palace. This last sovereign of the Romans had spent the night in prayer at Hagia Sophia, receiving communion one final time beneath the great dome that had sheltered Christian emperors for 900 years. Now, as enemy war drums began their ominous rhythm, Constantine donned simple armor and prepared to take his place among the common defenders who would share his fate. Giovanni Giustiniani had positioned his small force of Genoese professionals at the Mesotachion, the central section of the land defences, where Urban's great cannon had done its most devastating work. Around the condottiere, Greek citizens who had never held weapons in anger checked their makeshift equipment one last time. Monks who had traded prayer books for swords blessed their comrades. Foreign merchants who had chosen to remain gripped unfamiliar spears with sweating palms. At precisely 1 o'clock in the morning, the Sultan gave the signal that would change history. Across the Islamic lines, horns sounded the advance, while kettle drums thundered a rhythm that could be heard throughout the besieged metropolis. The first wave surged forward, Anatolian irregulars, Balkan volunteers, and dervishes seeking martyrdom in holy war. Their wild charge struck the battered fortifications like a human tsunami, accompanied by war cries in a dozen languages. Initial resistance proved fiercer than the attackers expected. Despite weeks of bombardment, the ancient masonry still stood, and the garrison had used every hour to strengthen their positions. Greek fire arced over the ramparts, turning advancing warriors into human torches. Crossbow bolts and arquebus shots cut down the foremost assailants. For 2 hours, this chaotic melee raged without decisive advantage to either side. The emperor himself appeared at critical points along the defenses, his purple cloak marking him clearly to friend and foe alike. Where the assault grew fierce, there Constantine could be found, encouraging his men with words and personal example. Enemy arrows sought the sovereign constantly, but divine providence or simple fortune kept him unharmed as the battle reached its climax. As the irregular assault began to falter, Mehmed committed his second wave. These Anatolian troops represented the backbone of Islamic military power, disciplined forces who had conquered most of Asia Minor and much of the Balkans. Unlike the enthusiastic but disorganized irregulars, these men advanced in formation, their officers maintaining control even under the heaviest defensive fire. Giustiniani's leadership proved crucial during this phase of the battle. The Genoese commander seemed to be everywhere at once, plugging gaps in the defenses, rallying wavering fighters, and coordinating the response to each new threat. His professional eye could read the flow of combat, anticipating where the next crisis would develop and positioning his limited reserves accordingly. Yet even heroic leadership could not overcome the mathematics of the situation. For every defender who fell, there were 20 attackers ready to take his place. Ammunition that had been carefully hoarded for weeks began to run low. Sections of the ancient barriers that had withstood earthquakes and previous battles started to crumble under the sustained assault. Around 4 a.m, as the second wave reached its crescendo, a crossbow bolt struck Giustiniani in the chest, piercing his breastplate and driving deep into his lung. The wound, though not immediately fatal, left the Genoese commander unable to continue fighting. As his men carried the condottiere away from the ramparts, panic began to spread among the garrison who had come to see their leader as invincible. The Sultan, observing from his command post, recognized the moment he had been waiting for. The Janissary drums began their distinctive rhythm, slower and more measured than the wild percussion that had accompanied the earlier assaults. These elite troops advanced with the confidence of men who had never known defeat, their white felt caps and flowing robes giving them an almost spectral appearance in the pre-dawn gloom. What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. Somewhere along the northern section of the land defences, a small gate called the Kerkerporta, used by the garrison for sorties against the besiegers, had been left unlocked after the last reconnaissance mission. Whether through oversight, treachery, or simple exhaustion, this minor breach in the seemingly impregnable defences became the key that unlocked the greatest metropolis in Christendom. A handful of Janissaries, led by a giant warrior named Hassan of Ulubad, discovered the unlocked portal and forced their way through. Once inside, they fought their way to the main gate and opened it for their comrades. Within minutes, Islamic forces were pouring into the stronghold that had defied conquest for over a millennium. News of the breach spread faster than the invaders themselves. Defenders who had held their positions through hours of desperate fighting began to waver as reports reached them that the enemy was already inside the fortifications. The psychological impact proved as devastating as any physical assault. Men who had been prepared to die defending the ramparts lost heart when they realized the defenses had been compromised. Constantine received word of the breakthrough while rallying the garrison near the central gate. The sovereign's response revealed the nobility that would make him a figure of legend. Rather than fleeing to a ship that might carry him to safety, the emperor chose to make his final stand where his ancestors had ruled for over 1,000 years. Stripping away the imperial regalia that marked his rank, Constantine took up sword and shield like any common fighter, His last recorded words, spoken to his remaining companions, captured the dignity of his sacrifice. "The metropolis is fallen, and I am still alive." Then, with a handful of loyal followers, the last ruler of the Romans charged into the Islamic tide that was sweeping through his capital. In the chaos that followed, the emperor's fate became lost to history. Some said Constantine fell fighting at the St. Romanos Gate, his body so mutilated that it could only be identified by the imperial eagles embroidered on his boots. Others claimed he died unknown among the common defenders, his corpse never found among the thousands that littered the streets. What remains certain is that the Roman Empire, which had endured for over 15 centuries, died with its sovereign on the ramparts of its greatest stronghold. As enemy forces flooded through the breached defences, the character of the battle changed from organized resistance to desperate survival. Civilians who had hoped the ancient barriers would protect them found themselves face to face with warriors drunk on victory and the promise of 3 days' plunder. Houses that had sheltered the same families for generations echoed with screams as their occupants faced the reality of conquest. Hagia Sophia became a refuge for thousands of citizens who believed that divine protection would save them where human defenses had failed. Families crowded into the great church, pressing against the altar where emperors had been crowned and praying for a miracle that would turn back the tide of conquest. When the great doors finally splintered under enemy axes, the sound marked not just the fall of a building, but the end of an age. Some defenders continued fighting, even after the main defences collapsed. Venetian and Genoese sailors battled to reach their ships in the harbour. Greek fighters made last stands in towers and isolated strongpoints throughout the metropolis. Yet these pockets of resistance could delay but not prevent the inevitable. By sunrise, Islamic banners flew from the ramparts that had protected the Queen of Cities for over 1,000 years. Catalan mercenaries who had fought alongside the garrison provided some of the most poignant accounts of these final hours. Don Francisco de Toledo, wounded but alive, wrote of seeing Greek women throwing their children from the ramparts rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Other witnesses described monks chanting psalms as they faced death, and merchants burning their goods rather than see them looted. Perhaps most symbolic was the fate of the great chain that had protected the Golden Horn. For generations, this massive barrier had been the pride of the capital's defences, a symbol of the ingenuity that had made the metropolis the queen of cities. Now enemy sailors methodically cut through the iron links, while their comrades celebrated victory on the shores beyond. Yet even in defeat, individual acts of heroism illuminated the darkness. Lucas Notarus, the grand logothete who had opposed union with Rome, chose to remain in the stronghold and face his fate rather than flee to safety. His dignity in captivity earned the respect even of his captors, though it could not save his life. Similarly, Cardinal Isidore, the papal legate whose presence had been so controversial, administered last rites to dying fighters of both faiths, until he too was overwhelmed by the tide of conquest. Women played roles in these final hours that challenged every convention of medieval warfare. The historian Leonikos Chalkokondyles recorded the story of a Greek woman who fought from the ramparts with such ferocity that enemy warriors initially mistook her for a man. When she finally fell, pierced by multiple arrows, her last act was to hurl a stone that killed one more attacker. As the sun rose on May 29th, 1453, it illuminated a metropolis transformed. Streets that had echoed with Greek and Latin for over a millennium now rang with Turkish and Arabic. Churches that had sheltered Christian worship since the age of Constantine prepared for conversion to Islamic use. Most dramatically, The great dome of Hagia Sophia, for 9 centuries the symbol of Christian power in the East, would soon echo with the call to prayer that announced a new master for the Queen of Cities. The death toll from this final assault remained a matter of dispute. Islamic sources, eager to emphasize their victory, spoke of rivers of blood running through the streets. Christian accounts, written by survivors and refugees, painted equally grim pictures of massacre and destruction. What cannot be disputed is that the population that had defended the stronghold so heroically paid a terrible price for their courage. Perhaps most tragically, many of the garrison who survived the battle itself perished in the chaos that followed. In the confusion of victory, enemy forces often could not distinguish between armed combatants and innocent civilians. Men who had laid down their weapons in hopes of receiving quarter found themselves cut down by warriors still drunk on the blood of battle. Sultan Mehmed's entry into his conquered prize came not with the immediate brutality that many had feared, but with a gesture that revealed both his ambition and his understanding of history. Dismounting at the door of Hagia Sophia, the young conqueror bent down and took a handful of earth, sprinkling it over his turban in a gesture of humility before God. Then, rising to his full height, the Sultan entered the greatest church in Christendom and declared it a mosque. The symbolism of this moment could not have been more complete. Where Christian emperors had worshipped for 9 centuries, a Muslim ruler now offered prayers of thanksgiving. The building that had represented the triumph of Orthodox Christianity over paganism, heresy, and Islam itself now served the faith of the Prophet. In this single act, the conquest became something more than military victory. It became the symbolic triumph of one civilization over another. As the day progressed and order was gradually restored, the full magnitude of what had been accomplished became clear. The metropolis that had called itself the New Rome, that had preserved the traditions of Caesar and Augustus for over 1,000 years, had finally fallen. The empire that had survived the barbarian invasions, the Arab conquests, the Crusades, and countless other challenges had breathed its last on the ramparts where its final sovereign had chosen to die rather than surrender. Yet even as one age ended, another began. The young conqueror who had captured the greatest prize in Europe and Asia would prove to be more than just a successful general. In the years to come, Mehmed II would transform his victory from an act of destruction into one of creation, building a new empire on the foundations of the old, and making the Queen of Cities the center of a realm that would span 3 continents. The sun that set on May 29th, 1453, marked the end of the longest political continuity in human history. But it also illuminated the beginning of a new chapter in the story of the stronghold where Europe and Asia meet, where the faiths and cultures of East and West would continue to encounter each other for centuries to come. The Queen of Cities had fallen, but she would rise again under new masters, as magnificent and enduring as ever. Silence fell over the Queen of Cities as Sultan Mehmed II walked through the gates that had barred his path for 53 days. The young conqueror moved not with the swagger of a victorious general, but with the measured pace of a man who understood the weight of history settling on his shoulders. Behind him lay the corpse-strewn ramparts where the last emperor had died. Before him stretched the greatest prize in Europe and Asia, won at last but requiring wisdom to govern. The immediate aftermath of conquest could have descended into an orgy of destruction that would have reduced the ancient metropolis to ruins. Military law granted victorious armies 3 days of unrestricted plunder, and Mehmed's warriors had earned their reward through blood and sacrifice. Yet the Sultan possessed a vision that transcended mere triumph. He had not fought for 53 days simply to rule over rubble and ashes, but to claim the inheritance of Caesar himself. Standing before the great portal of Hagia Sophia, the conqueror paused to perform a gesture that would resonate through the ages. Bending low, he scooped up a handful of earth and sprinkled it over his white turban, a traditional sign of humility before Allah that reminded both his followers and himself that all victory comes from divine will. Only then did he cross the threshold that separated Orthodox sanctuary from Muslim domain. Inside the greatest church of Eastern Christendom, shadows played across mosaics that had witnessed 1,000 years of imperial ceremony. Shafts of sunlight streaming through the dome's windows illuminated scenes of Christ and the Virgin that had inspired countless generations of believers. Now these same images looked down upon a Turkish ruler who approached the altar with reverence, not for the religious symbols, but for the craftsmanship that had created such beauty. The Sultan declared the profession of faith, his voice echoing through the vast space. With those sacred words, Hagia Sophia ceased to be a church and became a mosque. The transformation was accomplished not through destruction, but through adaptation. The mosaics would be covered rather than destroyed. The altar would be repositioned to face Mecca. Minarets would rise beside the ancient dome. The building that had symbolized Orthodox triumph would now proclaim Muslim victory. Yet its essential magnificence would endure. Yet Mehmed's concerns extended far beyond symbolic gestures. The metropolis he had conquered was a shadow of its former self, its population decimated by warfare, and its economy shattered by decades of decline. Whole districts lay abandoned, their houses crumbling, and their streets overgrown with weeds. The harbour that had once bustled with merchants from across the Mediterranean echoed with emptiness. To transform military conquest into lasting dominion, the Sultan would need to rebuild not just buildings, but an entire civilization. The first challenge was establishing order among his own forces. Warriors who had fought desperately for weeks suddenly found themselves masters of unimaginable wealth. Churches contained treasures accumulated over centuries. Private houses held the savings of merchant families. The imperial palace itself was a repository of art and precious objects that had been gathered from across the known world. Without firm control, this windfall could have triggered chaos that would have destroyed what the conquest had won. Mehmed moved with characteristic decisiveness to prevent such destruction. After allowing the traditional 3 days of plunder, he issued strict orders that further looting would be punishable by death. Guards were posted at major monuments and religious sites. Most importantly, he began the delicate process of transforming his army from a force of conquest into an administration of governance. The Sultan's treatment of the surviving population revealed both pragmatic calculation and genuine tolerance. Rather than enslaving or expelling the Greek inhabitants who remained, he actively encouraged them to stay and participate in rebuilding their homeland under different management. Tax incentives were offered to artisans and merchants who would resume their trades. Safe conduct was guaranteed to those who had fled during the fighting and wished to return. Perhaps most significantly, Mehmed appointed a patriarch to head the Orthodox Church under his protection. Gennadios Scholarios, a scholar who had opposed union with Rome, found himself elevated to a position that preserved Eastern Christianity while acknowledging Turkish supremacy. This arrangement, revolutionary for its time, allowed the conquered population to maintain their religious identity while accepting political subordination. The economic revival of the conquered metropolis required more than good intentions. Merchants needed security to resume trade. Craftsmen required raw materials to restart production. Farmers in the surrounding countryside had to be convinced that their harvests would not be confiscated by military governors. Mehmed addressed each of these challenges with policies that balanced religious principles with practical necessity. Trade agreements were negotiated with Venice and Genoa that restored commercial relationships disrupted by the conquest. These Italian merchants, who had wavered between profit and principle during the fighting, now found themselves welcomed back as valuable partners in reconstruction. Their ships would once again fill the Golden Horn, bringing goods from across the Mediterranean to markets that had stood nearly empty for months. The famous silk industry, which had been one of the pillars of the old economy, received particular attention from the administration. Skilled workers who had fled to Italian cities were offered incentives to return and share their expertise. Fresh workshops were established with government support. Within a few years, silk production had not only recovered, but exceeded its previous levels, as Middle Eastern markets opened opportunities for trade. Urban planning became another priority for the conqueror, who sought to create a worthy capital for his expanding realm. The Great Palace, damaged by neglect and warfare, was extensively renovated to serve as the center of Turkish administration. Mosques rose throughout the metropolis, their minarets creating a skyline that proclaimed the triumph of the faith. Gardens and fountains, following traditional architectural principles, brought beauty and tranquility to spaces that had been scarred by conflict. Perhaps most ambitious was the construction of Topkapi Palace, a vast complex that would serve as both royal residence and governmental center for centuries to come. Built on the site of the ancient Acropolis, overlooking the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, this architectural marvel combined Turkish design principles with the practical needs of administration. Its courtyards and pavilions would house a bureaucracy that governed territories from the Danube to the Indian Ocean. The intellectual life of the reborn metropolis flourished under Mehmed's patronage. The Sultan himself was a scholar of considerable accomplishment, fluent in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin. His court attracted learned men from across the Muslim world and beyond, creating an atmosphere of cultural exchange that had been absent during the final decades of Orthodox rule. Libraries that had been scattered or destroyed during the conquest were gradually rebuilt and restocked with manuscripts from throughout the realm. Religious architecture became a particular focus of the administration's building program. While Hagia Sophia remained the most prominent symbol of Turkish triumph, additional mosques were constructed that reflected distinctly Anatolian architectural traditions. The Fatih Mosque, built on the site of the Church of the Holy Apostles, demonstrated how Turkish architects could create buildings that rivaled the greatest achievements of their predecessors. The demographic transformation of the reborn metropolis required careful management to avoid the ethnic tensions that had plagued other conquered territories. Greeks who remained were joined by Turkish settlers from Anatolia, Muslim refugees from territories lost to European reconquest, and Jewish families fleeing persecution in the West. This mixture of populations created challenges, but also opportunities for cultural synthesis that would define the character of the reformed capital. Educational institutions played a crucial role in this process of cultural integration. Madrasas were established that taught religious law and theology, alongside practical subjects like mathematics and astronomy. The old university, which had virtually ceased to function during the final years of Orthodox rule, was revived under Turkish auspices with a curriculum that included both religious and secular subjects. The administrative system that emerged from this reconstruction effort combined legal principles with practical adaptations to local conditions. The millet system allowed different religious communities to govern their internal affairs according to their own traditions, while acknowledging the supreme authority of the Sultan. Greeks could follow orthodox canon law in matters of marriage and inheritance. Jews could observe their own religious practices, and various denominations could maintain their distinct identities. Maritime affairs received particular attention from a ruler who understood that control of the Bosphorus gave him leverage over trade between Europe and Asia. The harbour facilities that had fallen into disrepair during the final years of Orthodox rule were extensively renovated. Shipyards were constructed that could build vessels capable of challenging Venetian and Genoese dominance in Mediterranean waters. The conquered territory's strategic position made it an ideal base for further expansion into both Europe and Asia. Mehmed used his capital as a launching point for campaigns that extended Turkish control deep into the Balkans and consolidated dominance over much of Anatolia. Each victory brought wealth and population to the growing metropolis, creating a cycle of expansion and prosperity that would continue for generations. Cultural exchange flourished in ways that had been impossible during the final decades of Orthodox isolation. Turkish scholars gained access to Greek manuscripts that had been preserved in monastery libraries. Former artists found patrons among Turkish nobles who appreciated their skills. Italian merchants discovered that Turkish rulers could be more reliable trading partners than the impoverished princes they had previously served. The legal system that emerged from this cultural mixing reflected both religious principles and practical necessities. Religious law governed spiritual matters and personal conduct for Muslim subjects, while Orthodox believers and Jews were allowed to follow their own legal traditions in many areas. Commercial law borrowed elements from Venetian and Genoese practices that had proven effective in Mediterranean trade. Architecture became perhaps the most visible symbol of the transformed metropolis. Turkish architects, influenced by both traditional designs and the monuments they had inherited, created a distinctive style that would influence building throughout the Muslim world. Domes and minarets rose beside ancient columns and arches, creating a skyline that proclaimed both continuity and change. The palace culture that developed around Mehmed's court combined Turkish traditions with elements borrowed from both Orthodox and Muslim predecessors. Court ceremonies maintained the dignity appropriate to a successor of Caesar, while incorporating rituals that emphasized the Sultan's role as leader of the faithful. The famous Topkapi Palace became a center of learning and artistic patronage that attracted talent from across the known world. Economic policies designed to encourage growth and prosperity transformed the conquered territory from a declining backwater into a thriving commercial center. Tax structures were simplified and made more equitable. Trade guilds were reorganized to promote efficiency while maintaining quality standards. Currency reforms stabilized monetary systems that had been weakened by decades of debasement. The remarkable transformation of the conquered metropolis from Orthodox stronghold to Turkish capital demonstrated that military conquest, when combined with wise governance, could create something greater than what had existed before. Mehmed II had not merely captured a stronghold, he had created the foundation for a realm that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries to come. Yet this transformation came at a cost that could not be measured in gold or territory. The fall of the last remnant of the Roman Empire marked the end of a political tradition that had endured for over 15 centuries. The conversion of Hagia Sophia from church to mosque symbolized a fundamental shift in the religious and cultural identity of a region that had been Orthodox for over 1,000 years. As Mehmed the Conqueror looked out from his palace windows across the waters where Europe and Asia meet, he could see the fruits of his vision taking shape. Minarets rose beside ancient domes. Turkish ships sailed past Roman sea walls. Muslim merchants traded in markets that had been established by Orthodox emperors. The Queen of Cities had fallen, but from its ruins had risen something magnificent, a capital worthy of a realm that would bridge 2 continents and 3 seas. When the sun set on May 29th, 1453, it marked the end of the longest political continuity in human history. The Roman state, which had begun with Augustus Caesar's rise to power in 27 BC, breathed its last on the ramparts where Constantine XI Palaiologos made his final stand. For 1,480 years, through transformations that would have destroyed lesser institutions, the idea of Rome had endured, surviving barbarian invasions, religious upheavals, territorial losses, and dynastic changes that would have toppled any ordinary government. The psychological impact of this realm's demise rippled far beyond the immediate participants in the drama. Throughout Europe, scholars and princes who had grown accustomed to the existence of this final remnant suddenly found themselves living in a transformed reality. The conquest represented more than military defeat. It symbolized the triumph of a resurgent Islam over the Christianity that had defined continental identity for a millennium. Scholars who fled the conquered metropolis carried with them treasures more precious than gold or jewels, manuscripts containing the wisdom of ages that might otherwise have been lost forever. These refugees, scattered across Italian cities and courts, brought knowledge that would profoundly influence the intellectual awakening already stirring in the West. Platonic philosophy, Aristotelian logic, and mathematical treatises that had been preserved in Orthodox monasteries now found eager audiences in humanist circles from Florence to Paris. The printing press, that revolutionary invention of the 15th century, ensured that this learning would spread far beyond the narrow circles of elite scholars. Texts that had existed in only a few handwritten copies were soon reproduced by the hundreds, making classical knowledge accessible to anyone who could read. Universities throughout the continent expanded their curricula to include the rediscovered works, while artists and architects drew inspiration from descriptions of buildings and artistic techniques. Yet the influence of the conquest extended beyond intellectual circles to reshape the very geography of global commerce. For centuries, the Queen of Cities had served as the crucial link between Western markets and Asian sources of luxury goods. Silk from China, spices from India, and precious stones from distant lands had all passed through the metropolis on their way to consumers. The new Islamic control disrupted these traditional routes, forcing merchants to seek alternative paths to the riches of the East. Portuguese navigators, already exploring the African coast in search of a sea route to India, found their efforts suddenly transformed from speculative ventures into urgent necessities. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 opened a maritime highway that bypassed territories controlled by the new rulers entirely. Spanish expeditions, inspired by similar motives, stumbled upon an entirely different solution when Christopher Columbus encountered the Americas while seeking a western route to Asia. The age of exploration that followed can be traced directly to the consequences of the metropolis's transformation. Powers that had once relied on overland trade through the eastern Mediterranean now built global dominions spanning oceans that previous generations had never imagined crossing. Brazil, Mexico, India, and the Philippines became colonies partly because Islamic control of traditional trade routes forced Western nations to seek alternatives. The religious implications of the conquest proved equally profound. The Orthodox Church, deprived of its traditional imperial protector, found itself scattered across multiple political jurisdictions, while its spiritual center remained under Islamic rule. This dispersion paradoxically strengthened Orthodox identity in some regions while weakening it in others. Russian princes, who had long claimed to be the true heirs of Christian Rome, now proclaimed Moscow as the third Rome, destined to fulfill the spiritual mission that the former capital could no longer perform. Catholic territories responded to the transformation with a mixture of horror and opportunity. Papal calls for a new crusade to reclaim the former stronghold generated initial enthusiasm but little practical support. Rulers, preoccupied with their own territorial ambitions and religious divisions, proved unwilling to commit the resources necessary for such a distant enterprise. The Protestant Reformation, which erupted less than a century later, further fragmented Christian unity and made coordinated action against Islamic expansion even more unlikely. The cultural synthesis that emerged in the transformed metropolis created something unprecedented in medieval history. Under the new administration, the former capital became a cosmopolitan center where scholars worked alongside administrators, where Jewish refugees from persecution found opportunities denied them elsewhere, and where Italian merchants traded alongside Arab financiers. This multicultural flowering produced achievements in architecture, literature, and science that rivaled the greatest accomplishments of any previous era. The famous architect Sinan, whose works adorned the Ottoman capital throughout the 16th century, drew inspiration from both traditional designs and the architectural heritage he had inherited. His masterpiece, the Suleymaniye Mosque, demonstrated how builders could honor the past while creating something entirely original. The building's soaring dome paid homage to Hagia Sophia, while incorporating innovations that would influence mosque design throughout the Islamic sphere. Yet the transformation of the Queen of Cities came at a cost that extended beyond the immediate casualties of conquest. The unique civilization that had developed over more than a millennium, blending learning, law, and theology, vanished forever. Future generations would know this heritage only through books and ruins, never again experiencing the living culture that had connected the age of Constantine the Great to the final days of Constantine XI. The strategic balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean shifted decisively in favor of the new Islamic state. Naval supremacy, which had allowed Italian city-states to dominate trade for centuries, gradually passed to fleets operating from their unassailable base at the Bosphorus. Hungarian resistance, which had been the primary bulwark against expansion into Central Europe, weakened without the psychological support that the survival of the former Christian stronghold had provided. Within a generation of the conquest, armies stood at the gates of Vienna, the heart of the Holy Roman State. Only the heroic defense led by John Sobieski of Poland in 1683 prevented forces from advancing into Germany itself. The siege of Vienna became a mirror image of the siege of the Queen of Cities, except this time Christian Europe managed to save its most precious stronghold. The linguistic legacy of the transformation proved surprisingly durable. While the language of the conquerors became the tongue of government and high culture in the transformed metropolis, the local language survived in neighborhoods and communities that maintained their ethnic identity under the millet system. This linguistic preservation ensured that when independence movements emerged in the 19th century, they could draw upon unbroken traditions stretching back to the age of Pericles. Modern Istanbul, the successor to both the medieval capital and the original settlement, bears the imprint of all the civilizations that have shaped its destiny. Visitors today can see cisterns beneath palaces, Orthodox churches that became mosques, and medieval walls that witnessed the final stand of a realm. The city remains what it has always been, a bridge between East and West, a place where different cultures encounter each other and create something greater than the sum of their parts. The memory of Constantine XI, Palaiologos, the final ruler who chose death over surrender, became a symbol of heroic resistance throughout the Orthodox sphere. Legends grew around his final moments, transforming a historical figure into an embodiment of the values that his realm had represented. Whether he perished at the St. Romanos Gate or died anonymously among his soldiers mattered less than what his sacrifice came to symbolize: the principle that some things are worth defending even unto death. The scholarly debate over the conquest's significance continues to this day. Some historians argue that it marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the modern era. Others contend that it represented merely one event in the long transformation of civilization. What cannot be disputed is that the end of the final remnant of Rome marked a turning point after which everything was fundamentally different. The Queen of Cities endures, more beautiful and populous than ever before. The Bosphorus still carries ships between Europe and Asia. The Golden Horn still shelters vessels from across the globe. Hagia Sophia, now once again a mosque after briefly serving as a museum, continues to inspire awe in visitors who stand beneath its dome. The physical city has not only survived but flourished under successive rulers who understood its unique importance. Yet something irreplaceable was lost on that May morning when the final sovereign perished defending walls that had protected his ancestors for over 1,000 years. The dream of Rome, that ideal of universal dominion under divine sanction, died with Constantine XI. Never again would rulers claim with credibility to be the successors of Caesar and Augustus. The globe had become a more complicated place, divided among competing states and nations that acknowledged no universal authority. The story of the metropolis's transformation remains relevant today because it illustrates how even the most enduring institutions can succumb to the pressures of a changing reality. The realm that ended in 1453 had survived barbarian invasions, civil wars, religious controversies, and economic crises that would have destroyed most governments. Yet it could not ultimately adapt to the military technologies, economic systems, and political arrangements that defined the early modern period. Perhaps the most profound lesson of this historical drama is that endings can also be beginnings. The conquest that destroyed one civilization helped create another. The dispersal of learning contributed to the Renaissance. The disruption of traditional trade routes led to the age of exploration. The transformation of the former capital into Istanbul created one of the planet's greatest cities. Even in defeat and death, the final sovereign and his metropolis left legacies that continue to shape our reality today. The sun that set on the Roman state in 1453 rose upon an age of global exploration, cultural exchange, and technological innovation. The Queen of Cities, though under new masters, remained what she had always been, a place where civilizations meet, where the wisdom of the past encounters the possibilities of the future, and where the dreams of one age become the foundations of the next.